In April 2024, in a room at Royal Lodge that hasn't been redecorated since 1955, Prince Andrew sat across from a member of his staff. He was angry that no one had told him a guest was waiting. He was angry that the wine had been the wrong temperature. He had not, his staff said later, raised his voice. He didn't have to. The room he was sitting in had been arranged by his grandmother. The chair he was sitting in had been hers. The way he was speaking to his staff was the way she had spoken to hers. For 50 years, in 5 different houses, to 3 different generations of British servants. The old girl trained him well. And she did it on purpose. That last line is not the verdict of a tabloid. It is, almost word for word, the most upvoted comment on a YouTube video about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Underneath a long-form documentary about her household staff, hundreds of people who had watched the same clips and read the same biographies arrived at the same single sentence. The old girl trained him well. Because he displays the same attitude and behaviors. And further down the page, a second comment, almost as upvoted as the first. Andrew took after his grandmother, rude, entitled, and living off the monarchy. The audience had already done the analysis. They had watched the staff testimony about Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman who married into the royal family in 1923, became queen in 1936, and lived as Queen Mother until 2002. And they had watched a separate set of staff testimony about her grandson, Andrew, the second son who is no longer a prince. And in the gap between those 2 sets of testimony, they had recognized a pattern. This is the video about that pattern. 5 specific behaviors, 1 household, 2 generations. The 5 behaviors are these: entitlement to immediate staff service, contempt for anyone outside the inner circle, working day drinking, a permanent expectation of money that never quite arrives, and the refusal to be questioned by anyone, including, in 2019, a journalist from the BBC. What the staff who served Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon described was not a temperament, it was a culture. And what the staff who served Andrew Mountbatten Windsor describe is the same culture, surfacing 40 years later, in the same houses, around the same chairs, with the same expectations applied to a new generation of British servants who never met her. The single piece of evidence that anchors this whole video is that Andrew now lives in her house. Not metaphorically, literally. Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park. 30 rooms, 21 acres. The house Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was given in 1952 after her husband died. The house she lived in for 50 years. The house she died in on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101. The following August, the Crown Estate signed a 75-year lease over to her grandson. He paid £1 million for the lease and spent $7.5 million on refurbishments. The annual rent, according to the lease itself, is 1 peppercorn, if demanded. He moved in. He kept the furniture. He kept the letters. He kept the windy house that had belonged to his mother, still standing in the garden. And he kept, his staff said later, the way the household worked. That is where this story starts. Not with Andrew, with her. Before we go on, the proof for what follows comes from 2 parallel sources. On Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's side, the staff testimony assembled in Tom Quinn's Backstairs Billy, Lady Colin Campbell's 2012 biography, Hugo Vickers's more sympathetic 2005 portrait, William Shawcross's official 2009 record, and the diaries of Sir Alan Lascelles, her private secretary, held at Churchill College, Cambridge. On Andrew's side, Andrew Lowney's 2025 book entitled, drawn from 4 years of research, more than 100 interviews with ex-staff, and a series of Freedom of Information requests. 2 staffs, 2 centuries of service between them. the same room. Here is what they say in parallel. Behavior 1. Entitlement to immediate staff service. The Queen Mother's gin and tonic was made for her by her page, William Tallon, for 51 years. He started in 1951, aged 15. He died in 2007. In between, according to Tom Quinn's biography of him, he made her gin and tonics in a specific ratio, 9/10 gin to 1/10 tonic, and he made them whenever she signaled that the magic hour had arrived. At 6 in the evening, she would turn to her page and ask, "Colin, are we at the magic hour?" And the answer was always yes, because Talon's actual job was not strictly to make drinks. It was to be present and to be ready, and to know what she wanted before she said it. The household ran on that principle. The Burke Hall summers — Burke Hall is the smaller house on the Balmoral estate where she spent every August — were structured around her preferences. Staff carried her gin trolley up the stairs when she moved between rooms. They knew the order of the courses she would want without being told. They knew which staff she would and would not speak to. They knew that being in her presence required, at all times, that you anticipate. Now move forward 40 years. The same house, give or take a wing. The same expectation, give or take a grandson. The testimony from Andrew Lowney's entitled, published by HarperCollins in August 2025, is staff testimony of the same shape. Andrew, his staff told Lowney, treated the people who worked for him as if they existed solely to serve him. A maid was sent upstairs to open his curtains, 4 flights of stairs. The Duke was lying right beside the window. He did not draw them himself. He rang. She climbed. That is the same behavior. The vocabulary is different. The grandmother's version was charm-coded. She rang, she smiled, she made it feel like a favor she was conferring rather than a service she was demanding. The grandson's version is colder, but the operating principle is the same. The household exists to anticipate me. I do not move. They move. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. Charlotte Biggs, who worked as a maid at Buckingham Palace in the mid-1990s, told Lowney that Andrew kept 72 stuffed toys on his bed. They had to be arranged by size. There was a full day's training for new staff on how the toys should be placed. The protection officer, Paul Page, later produced the handwritten arrangement instructions. 2 toy hippos, a black panther, bears, 3 cushions marked Daddy, Ducks, and Prince. Specific ribbon placements. If the maid got the order wrong, in Biggs's own words, the prince would scream and shout. "It took me half an hour to arrange them," she said. Most bizarre thing to be paid for. That is not entitlement as character flaw. That is entitlement as ritual. The household has been trained to perform the ritual. The ritual is the relationship. And the ritual, when you put the grandmother's noon gin trolley next to the grandson's 72 stuffed toys, is the same ritual. Anticipation. Arrangement. The body of the heir does not move. The hands of the household do. Behavior 2. Contempt for the outside world. The Queen Mother's biographers describe a private register and a public register, and the marked gap between them. Cecil Beaton, who photographed her, who knew her, who attended her at Clarence House, called her a marshmallow made on a welding machine. That is the canonical line. It is also the closest the historical record gets to an official admission of the split. The public register was the wave, the pastel hat, the smile, the morale of the nation framing she cultivated through 50 years of widowhood. The private register, the welding machine register, was the one her staff lived inside. And in private, what staff testimony documents is contempt, not for one person, but for the entire category of people who were not inside her inner circle. The footmen who left after a year, the maids who never received a leaving party, the press officers who tried to ask questions about the financial position of the household. They were, in the words of one of the men who served her longest, simply not real to her. The staff existed. The press did not. The public, in the abstract, did. The press, in the specific, did not. What's strange about this is that her own self-description matched. Asked once how the public got her wrong, she said, "I'm not nearly as nice as people think I am." That gap between the public version and the private version became institutional. It became how the household defended itself. When journalists asked questions, the household referred to her as the beloved grandmother of the nation. When staff complained, the household referred to her as the beloved grandmother of the nation. When questions came in about her finances, about her schedule, about how she actually conducted herself in the rooms the public did not see, the answer was always, in effect, "Do not ask." Then, in November 2019, her grandson did the same thing on national television. Andrew sat down with Emily Maitlis for a BBC Newsnight interview at Buckingham Palace on the 14th of November 2019. The interview was broadcast 2 nights later. The subject was his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor, who had died in his Manhattan jail cell 3 months earlier. The interview ran for 58 minutes. Andrew came out of it, according to one editor at the Times, as the worst public relations crisis the royal family had faced since the death of Diana. What he did across those 58 minutes, and this is the part that matters for our purposes, was demonstrate, in real time, the institutional contempt for being questioned that his grandmother had built. He told Maitlis he had no recollection of ever meeting Virginia Giuffre. The line was, "I have no recollection of ever meeting this lady. None whatsoever." He told her, on a separate question, "I'm convinced that I was never in tramps with her." He told her, on the matter of where he was on the 10th of March 2001, that he had been at home with his daughters after taking Princess Beatrice to a Pizza Express in Woking. He told her, when she asked why he would remember that going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do, a very unusual thing for me to do. And on the matter of whether he had been sweating that night at Tramp, he told her he had a peculiar medical condition. "I don't sweat," he said. Or, "I didn't sweat at the time, because of an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands." The record on what he said is the BBC transcript. The record on what it sounded like is the response from every newsroom on Fleet Street the following morning. What it demonstrated, beyond the specifics of the allegations, was the same institutional reflex his grandmother had cultivated for half a century. When questioned by an outsider, do not answer. When pressed, change the subject. When the gap between the public version and the private version becomes visible, refer to the public version. He was not lying about Pizza Express to clear himself. He was performing the position that he should not be required to answer in the first place. The interview did not fail because the answers were bad. It failed because the answers came from inside a household that did not believe it was answerable. That is the second behavior, and it has a fingerprint. Behavior 3. Working day drinking. Here we step carefully, because the brief itself flags this one. The exact volumes, the exact hours, the exact rules, they have not been published as official policy. What has been published is the daily ritual. The biographer, Lady Colin Campbell, and after her, the journalist Hugo Vickers, and after them, William Shawcross in the 2009 official biography, all describe the Queen Mother's drinking day as a sequence of named occasions. Gin and Dubonnet at noon, 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin, then red wine through lunch, then a martini at 6, then 1 or 2 glasses of pink champagne with dinner. That sequence was so established that William Tallon, her page, would receive specific instructions in writing. One handwritten note, sent to him to organize a picnic, asks him to be sure to include 2 bottles of Dubonnet and gin, in case it was needed. The note was later sold at auction for $25,000. Notice what is not in that note. There is no embarrassment. There is no qualification. The instruction is sent to a member of staff with the assumption that staff will procure the alcohol, transport it to the location, stage it on the table, and serve it discreetly through the afternoon. That is the household's working pattern. Now the grandson. The Pizza Express alibi was, on the surface, an alcohol-related answer. Andrew was being asked where he was at a specific hour on a specific night. The answer he gave, Pizza Express in Woking, placed him not in a nightclub, not in a private home, not in a setting where alcohol would have been the social currency, but in a chain pizza restaurant taking his daughter to a birthday party at lunchtime. The defense was structurally identical to his grandmother's. He was not denying that he drank. He was denying that the drinking happened in a setting where the household couldn't manage the optics. And that is the inheritance, if there is one, not the volume, not even necessarily the pattern. The inheritance is the assumption, encoded in the household over half a century, that the drinking is the household's problem to absorb, not yours. The household carries the trolley. The household carries the alibi. The drinker is never asked to account. The pattern repeated. Behavior 4. A permanent expectation of money that never quite arrives. The Queen Mother's overdraft at Coutts at the time of her death in 2002 was £4 million. Her annual civil list allowance, the official state allowance that funded her public expenses, was £643,000. Reporting on her finances, published after her death by Penny Junor and Brian Hoey, described an overspend pattern that ran for decades. In the last year of her life, she spent £4 million more than her official income. The deficit was made up by her daughter. Queen Elizabeth II subsidized her mother to the tune of approximately £2 million a year. The Prince of Wales, then Charles, contributed further sums from his own household. The estate she left behind was valued between £50 and £70 million. The £4 million overdraft sat on top of that. Now move to her grandson. In 2014, Andrew launched a business initiative called Pitch at Palace. It was structured as an accelerator and incubator that introduced entrepreneurs to potential investors at St. James's Palace. The arrangement was that early-stage companies would pitch, and the prince would convene the room. In 2019, after the Epstein scandal broke into the open, UK operations of Pitch at Palace were suspended. By February 2025, Pitch at Palace Global Limited had been struck off the company's house register through voluntary dissolution. The final filing showed cash reserves had fallen from £220,990 to £10,965 in the final 12 months. The sole director on the dissolution filing was the accountant, Arthur Lancaster. The same year that Pitch at Palace was winding down, court documents and reporting tied to the cryptocurrency firm Pegasus Group Holdings described payments of over £200,000 to Sarah Ferguson, with potential further payments up to £1.4 million. Andrew himself received £60,500 traced to a related entity called Alphabet Capital, controlled by an associate named Adrian Gleave. None of those payments were ever fully explained by the parties involved. That is the same shape. A permanent expectation. Income arriving from sources that were not clean. Bills accumulating that someone else had to settle. In the grandmother's case, the someone else was Queen Elizabeth II. In the grandson's case, the someone else was also Queen Elizabeth II. She footed his private security bill until her death in 2022. And after her death, the funding question fell to King Charles, who is now publicly negotiating compensation for his brother's surrender of the remainder of the Royal Lodge lease. 2 generations, the same bank, the same overdraft posture, the same expectation that the institution will, in the end, find the money. But here's what the public record carefully leaves out. The institution can no longer absorb it. Pitched Palace was a brand exercise, not a business. The civil list has been replaced by the sovereign grant. The overdraft model the Queen Mother lived inside, supportable in the 1980s, awkward in the 90s, controversial in the 2000s, became untenable in the 2020s. The grandson, in other words, has inherited the financial behavior at the moment the financial infrastructure has run out. He is doing what she did. He cannot do what she did indefinitely. Behavior 5. The refusal to vacate. In 1952, when George VI died, his widow was expected to move out of Buckingham Palace so that her elder daughter, the new queen, could move in with her husband and small children. That is the standard accession protocol. The new monarch occupies the principal palace. According to multiple staff accounts assembled in the channel's prior coverage and supported by biographical detail in Hugo Vickers and Lady Colin Campbell, the Queen Mother did not move on schedule. The move took most of a year to complete. The accounts of how it was negotiated diverge in detail, but the pattern is consistent. She did not refuse to move in words. She did not stage a confrontation. She simply did not leave on the timetable expected. Elizabeth II, by some accounts, had to ask twice. Eventually, the move was made to Clarence House. Now, 70 years later. In January 2022, the Queen approved the removal of Andrew's military titles and royal patronages over the Epstein lawsuit. By 2023, King Charles had offered his brother a relocation from Royal Lodge to Frogmore Cottage, a smaller property, on grounds of security cost. Andrew refused. By 2024, the pressure had become public. The headline figure being reported was that to remain at Royal Lodge, he would need to fund £2.5 million of repairs personally. He could not. The dispute became one of the most visible internal royal family negotiations of the decade. He still did not leave. On the 30th of October, 2025, Buckingham Palace announced that he would lose the Prince style and the Duke of York title, and that he would vacate Royal Lodge. He moved out in February 2026. Almost 2 years after the eviction conversation began. Almost 23 years after he had moved in. The pattern holds. Note what is structurally identical between the two refusals. Neither one was framed as confrontation. Neither one was a no, in words. Both were absences of yes. Both lasted longer than the institution could afford. Both ended only when the next generation of monarch, Elizabeth II to her mother in 1953, King Charles to his brother in 2025, applied direct pressure that could no longer be deflected. And in both cases, the person being asked to leave was being asked to leave the house that had been arranged for them in 1952. She didn't refuse. She let the silence do the asking. He didn't refuse. He let the cost do the same. That is behavior 5. And it is the behavior that links most directly back to behavior 1. Because what entitlement to immediate staff service really is, when you trace it down to its grammatical core, is the assumption that the house, with all of its servants and arrangements, will continue to exist on your terms, indefinitely, until someone with more authority than you intervenes. Which is exactly what refusing to vacate is, expressed as a real estate question. The 5 behaviors taken together form a household culture. Not a personality, not a psychology. A household culture. The grammar of how a particular kind of room was run on a particular kind of property in a particular kind of family for most of the 20th century. So why this grandson specifically? Why Andrew and not Charles, or Anne, or Edward? Here we step carefully again. There is no public archival evidence that the Queen Mother singled Andrew out for deliberate instruction. What there is, instead, is the documented record of 2 long stretches of childhood. The summers at Burke Hall, where Andrew was present for most of his school holidays through the 1960s and 1970s, and the weekends at Royal Lodge, before and after his parents' formal duties, where the Queen Mother received her grandchildren in a household she controlled. Andrew spent more total weeks of his childhood under his grandmother's specific household arrangement than Charles did. Charles was older, frequently absent, and lived inside the apparatus of air training that his grandmother had limited input over. Andrew was younger, more flexible, less under instruction, and, by every account from the resident staff, the grandchild she most visibly enjoyed. This is the part of the record where biographers have differed. Hugo Vickers, in his sympathetic 2005 biography, describes the Burke Hall summers as warmth itself. William Shawcross's official 2009 account treats them the same way. Lady Colin Campbell's 2012 account, more disputed in its larger claims, more useful in its staff testimony, describes the same summers as the period when Andrew most thoroughly absorbed the household routine. 3 different framings of the same set of weeks. The shared factual core is the time itself, the amount of time, the repetition of the routine, the household running, summer after summer, the same way. This was, in many ways, the same kind of upbringing she'd had. At Glamis, the Bows lie an ancestral seat in Scotland, where she had grown up watching her own parents run a household full of servants in the same register of entitlement and warmth. The household she was raised inside became the household she ran. The household she ran became the household her grandson absorbed. 2,000 years of one family's grammar, compressed across 3 generations, repeating. And there is one more comparison that matters here. Princess Margaret, her younger daughter, the one her own staff and other royal staff frequently identified as the most spoiled of the Queen Mother's children. Margaret was permitted, as a child, to stay up to dinner at 13. She was, according to the courtiers who served her father, his joy where Elizabeth was his pride. The household indulged her in ways Elizabeth was not indulged. And accounts diverge on whether the same household indulgence later produced the same behavior in adulthood: the chain smoking, the late nights, the resistance to constitutional discipline. But here is what is clear. The daughter the Queen Mother trained, in the household sense, was Margaret. The grandson the Queen Mother trained, in the same sense, was Andrew. The patterns Margaret displayed, and the patterns Andrew now displays, trace back not to 2 separate personalities, but to one household, running its own internal grammar across 2 generations of inheritor. The training, his grandmother's staff said, is the kind you can't unlearn, because it isn't training at all. It's just what the household looked like when you grew up inside it. That is the comparison the channel has been circling for 2 years and never quite landed. Lascelles, the private secretary, kept diaries through the late 1940s and 1950s, and parts of those diaries are now public. Other parts remain held at Churchill College, Cambridge, and have not been released. The exact private memos the Queen Mother's biographers refer to, the institutional record of complaints from her household, the documented frustrations of the institution with her financial and behavioral management, remain in those private papers. The diaries we have access to make plain that Lascelles considered the Queen Mother's household management a constitutional problem. The diaries we do not have access to may contain more specific itemization. The record is contested at the level of paperwork, but unanimous at the level of pattern. What the staff said about Talon's dismissal is the closing image. After 51 years of service, after a half-century of 9/10 gin to 1/10 tonic, of the magic hour, of the picnic notes about Dubonnet, of the gin trolley up the stairs at Burke Hall, of every household ritual the Queen Mother depended on, William Tallon learned of her death in March 2002 from a journalist who happened to telephone him at Gate Lodge, Clarence House. The household had not called. The household, in its post-mortem sweep, was already moving on. A few weeks later, he received a short letter telling him to vacate Gate Lodge. There was no leaving party. There was no letter of thanks. There was no formal acknowledgement of the 51 years he had given her. As far as the household was concerned, Tallon said, I was simply an ex-employee, as if I'd worked in the palace for 6 months washing bottles. That, more than any of the documented misconducts, is the verdict on the household. The household was not capable of warmth toward a person who had given it 50 years, because the household had never been built to acknowledge the service of anyone outside its inner ring. The inner ring was small. It included family, almost no friends, certain favored staff at certain times in certain moods. It did not include the man who made her drink for half a century. The dismissal letter to Tallon in 2002 is the same letter, in posture, as the dismissal of David Anderson by Andrew at Hillsborough Castle in 2005. The head of household whom Andrew, on hearing Anderson refer to the Queen as the Queen Mother, called a fucking imbecile. Different vocabulary, same household. Same grammar, same disposable register applied to the same kind of life. 2 generations, 2 pages of staff testimony, 1 letter written in 2002, 1 outburst recorded in 2005. Both come out of the same room. The thing the staff said was that he wasn't imitating her. He hadn't seen her be that person. He was that person, the same way she had been. The same eye contact, the same voice, the same sigh when the answer was no. The training, his grandmother's staff said, was the kind you can't unlearn, because it isn't training at all. It's just what the household looked like when you grew up inside it. And she'd grown up inside it too.